Yes.
Welcome again to another edition of Faith Matters at Eastminster Presbyterian Church in East Lansing. Today our guest is Elder Mary Harvey. We're going to chat a little bit about the intersections of faith and life with Mary. So Mary, thank you for giving us some time to chat today.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure to be with you.
Mary, you and I have something in common. We both grew up as a PK, which for those watching it might not be familiar with that term, preacher's kid. And so I wondered if you could share some of your earliest memories of church as a PK.
I can. It was kind of fun to think about this because I haven't thought about it for a while, but it was mostly fun. The downside was always having to leave one community and move to another one. That was my biggest complaint about that. But a lot of people experience that no matter what career their parents are in. But that was always hard for me starting a new school. Everybody at church pretty much knew my sister and I, and so that sort of gave you an in with people. It was fun to play in the church on a Saturday afternoon when my sister and I needed some adult to watch us. But we were romping through the church in the basement in the sanctuary, and not in a destructive way, but just, trying out the chair by the pulpit and all those kind of things that little kids like to do. So it was fun, and for the most part, as I always say to other preachers' kids, well, we survived. So it was a good experience, and I certainly learned a lot. The dinner table conversations were always one thing. I always had questions about the rituals and why this and why that, and I wish I was better at retaining that, but it's gotten reinforced with continuing on in the life of the church, so that's good.
Now, through those moves, is there one or two particular church communities that you sort of have claimed as your home community, or maybe that you were at the longest in childhood that has stuck with you?
Yes, the church in Brooklyn, Michigan, is what I would have considered my home church. Dad was there for 20 years. I was 10 when we moved there, and I left at 17 when I graduated from high school. But Mom and Dad were still there, so when I was home from college or other things, that was where I went. And I almost always went to church if I was home on a Sunday and reconnected with people. And one of the things that in the early days of my first time or two of visiting Eastminster, the church and the welcoming feeling I got there was just reminded me so much of Brooklyn that it quickly won a place in my heart, because I felt that same sense of family at Eastminster that I did when I was elementary school and high school and even beyond that. So that's my favorite place, probably next to Eastminster.
And when did you first come to Eastminster and discover East Lansing's Eastminster Presbyterian?
Well, oddly enough, and I kind of had forgotten about this until I'd been to Eastminster a time or two, and then I remembered back to being a freshman at Michigan State, and one of the girls that lived right across the hall from me was a Presbyterian, and of the 20 or so of us that were at our end of the hall on our dorm floor, we were the only two Presbyterians. So she said there's a church that somebody would come and pick us up, because we lived at the far east side of campus, no transportation, of course. So anyway, a couple who had two little girls came and picked us up a couple of times for church on Sunday morning. And so that was my very first time at Eastminster, and that was before the sanctuary was added on. So I was there in the very early days when there were just folding chairs set up in what is now the green room, and it was bigger then. So that was my first foray to Eastminster. And then a decade passed before I came back again. I think maybe even longer than that. But when I came back to Eastminster, I was living on my own in East Lansing, and no, that's wrong. Bruce and I were married, and I was facing surgery, and I was feeling really uncomfortable about it, not sure how it was going to go. So I thought, well, I'll see if I can connect with a church. And I came to Eastminster. I formed a bond with Anna K. Baker, who was an associate pastor or assistant pastor. I'm not sure what her title was. And so she was very helpful to me during my surgery and recovery. And before long, I was in a new member class with her, and I was getting to know the other members in that, of those of us who were in that class who were going to join the church. And then the next thing I knew, Anna Kay, who was director of the bell choir, said, "Mary, you should play bells." And I said, "Of course I will." So that helped me get to know a lot of other people in the church, and it just became easier and easier to be there and to be part of the church family.
Very good. Was there a particular time from childhood, young adulthood, post college, besides what you just said about a surgery kind of being the impetus to reach back out to a church, but was there a time that you sort of remember claiming faith for yourself as opposed to just being something you did because of what your dad did?
Well, that's a good question. I think I kind of went in and out of that a bit. I would say it wasn't until after I was at Eastminster that I really began to solidly claim my own faith and to grow in my faith. Otherwise, it was just, a toe in the water here and there and not very much. So I would have to say that Eastminster was very much a part of my formative, my own personal faith.
And in these strange times we find ourselves is in how we do faith formation, how we experience it when we're staying at home and staying safe during this pandemic.
Mm.
What have you found as sustaining to your faith, and what have you found, if anything, that's challenged your faith in these times?
That's a big question. Um, I think one of the first things when I first became an elder many, many years ago, I went on I think it was a synod retreat that was held on Mackinac Island. And I had just agreed to be an elder on Christian Education Committee. And there were a half dozen or so of us um, who went on this retreat. And out of that group, there were several of us who decided that we had enjoyed being with each other and we wanted to form a covenant group. And I think that was really important. A number of those people have moved away by now, but Charlotte Smith and Robin Turner are the two people who are still in the congregation that were very much an important part of that group. So we, even after other people were moving away, Charlotte and Robin and I kept meeting, and we'd find a book to study and have conversation. We'd usually have dinner together and just really cemented our faith friendship. And we still turn to one another in times of joy and sorrow. And I think that will continue for as long as we're around. And then I've also found I do well with other people in a small group where we really can get to know one another. And if you've had an opportunity, any of you who are watching, to travel with Robin Bell and her cohort, that's another way to challenge ourselves and find out what we're made of. And for me, travel is always a faith adventure anyway, because I'm not the best traveler, but I love doing it. Challenges, I think probably I've been very, very lucky during this time period that my husband and I are in a property in DeWitt Township that has 3 acres, and our life is here in terms of hobbies, whether it's vegetable gardening or flower gardening or just hanging around outside on the deck. And there's a ton of work to be done, so we never are at a loss for anything to do. But a lot of my solace is found when I'm outdoors, either just sitting or wandering the property, but especially when I'm working in the garden. So I would have to say, to try to answer your question, going back to the challenge, we've stayed in touch with our families and haven't been terribly challenged. So it's been okay. I still find myself thinking, well, I'm going to church for this or that, and then I am brought up short and go, I'm not going anywhere. We're Zooming church, or we're FaceTiming, or we're Facebook Live, or whatever. And so it's a challenge to not get in the car, I guess, which, by all measures is not much of a challenge at all. So I feel like I've been very, very fortunate. I don't know. Am I answering your question?
Sure.
I'm not sure where we are.
Absolutely. I think both the home, and what a gift to have the space that you do. And like you say, name the hobbies that you have that are right there in space where you can do some of those things. And yet some of what you've given up in what you love to do. And you mentioned travel, and obviously you can't do that right now. Is there a go-to trip or somewhere on your destination list that you haven't yet visited that's at the top of the list that you look forward to being able to schedule in the hopefully not too distant future?
Well, oddly enough, you asked that on the very day that some of us were planning to leave for Paris. So that trip was canceled. So I would say that's my next hope, is to get to France. And beyond that, I've always wanted to go to Greece. So that's another place that I hope to get to someday. As to whether or not we can even get in the car and drive to St. John's, who knows,
That's right.
So I had to cancel a trip to see my sister and brother-in-law in Oregon that I was supposed to do in early March. So she's high on my list as to when I feel like I can fly safely. I'm anxious to see her and her family.
Absolutely. You mentioned your love of books, and most that know you have a deep love of books, and that was even part of your vocation through the years. And I wonder where did that love initially start?
Well, when I was from about age 3 to 8, we lived in a small town in Ohio that would be kind of like Mason, Michigan, if you think about what that downtown looks like. It would be similar to that. And they had an adorable little library. And Mom used to walk my sister and I up to the library, I think probably at least once a week. And my mom read to us. When we were old enough to read on our own, both my sister and I loved to read. And my parents had books, and both my sister and I have some of their books that were, opera stories and fairy tales, and even the Bobbsey twins books from my mom when she was a little girl. So the fact that both of our parents enjoyed reading, and they did what people advise now, is let your kids see you reading, because in the evening or on a Saturday night, you could find either one or both of my parents reading, either nonfiction or fiction. And it was very obvious to my sister and I that they really found that enjoyable. So we both are big readers. One of the questions that Nancy, my sister, and I pose to one another in our frequent phone calls are, what are you reading now? Did you just finish something good? Would you recommend it? So she's one of my many reading partners that we have a good time talking about books. So it's just been all of my life has been reading.
So what of your recent reads do you recommend?
Oh my goodness. Um, this is where I always get tongue-tied trying to remember the titles of books. Um, I enjoyed the Hilary Mantel books, Wolf Hall and Bringing Up the Bodies. And I know she has a new one out. She was going for a trilogy, and her third book is just out this month, I think. So I'm looking forward to that. Um, I like mysteries. I like historical fiction. I like a lot of nonfiction as well. I know some people don't like it, but um, I'm not going to be able to think of the author's name. But we've done um, some of his, at least one of his books in our Page Turners book group at the church, The Big Burn, and I can't think of his name, but that's neither here nor there. There aren't very many books that I don't find some redeeming value in. I'm just starting to read the book that was recommended to the Page Turners for the month of May, which is, let me look at the title, Inspired by Rachel Held Evans, who unfortunately just died this past year or two. So that's nonfiction, and part of the subtitle is Learning to Love the Bible Again. So I know that's going to be an interesting read. And my go-to last week or 3 weeks ago, maybe, when I couldn't get into any books that I had here at home, I downloaded the first Harry Potter book, and that did the trick. I got totally lost in it, engrossed. I didn't put it down and walk away. So, there are times when you just need something that's familiar, but yet a fantasy world that's so different from your own. So that one worked for me.
Sounds like a good escape in these days for sure.
It was.
You mentioned the Rachel Held Evans book that you're getting ready to read and discovering the Bible. Is there a particular Bible story or Bible person that sort of captures your imagination?
Oh, that's an interesting question. And I don't know that there is. I flit from one to another, I think, depending on what's being preached about and what we're studying. So I don't have a good answer for that. I like anything that tells me that I think it's Psalm 139 that tells me that God knew me before I was born, and I love that image, to know that I was loved and welcomed and a child of God. So I think that's one of my favorite verses.
I think that's one that holds the test of time very well. And speaking of being a child of God and books and story time, is there a timeless storybook, children's storybook, that's been a popular thing in this day and age that we're in, of online reading from authors themselves or parents and teachers reading to folks? We've got Bev Bonning reading for our kids, doing some recording. Is there a particular children's book that may be under the radar of parents today that you think should be discovered?
I don't know that it's under the radar, but it's certainly a classic, is the Winnie the Pooh stories. I've always loved those. And I've been known to go back and pick up one of those books. And then there were offshoots from that of, the Tao of Pooh and things like that have come along. Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass are two of my favorites. And I go back and reread those or portions of them from time to time. I think that those are the ones that come to mind.
Excellent. And in this time when we're starting this, in the middle of it, really not starting it, the sermon series about the heart of the matter, what's a story or a memory that stirs in your heart when you think about all of the time that you've been in the life of the church?
Hmm. I think I think for me it's been the love of people in the church community for my parents when they were facing trials with health issues, and the same for me at Eastminster, as I just feel such love there, being given and being received, and it's a very emotional, stirring thing to have witness to that. It's a blessing.
Well, Mary, I thank you. You are a blessing to Eastminster, and I thank you for giving us some time and sharing a bit of your faith story with us and why faith matters to you and the intersections of faith and life. And so, thank you for spending some time with us today.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure. Thank you, Neil.